You know, where'd Aaron go? There you are. That was pretty good, wasn't it? Wow. This morning, my intention is to introduce you to the title of this book, The Soul's Code, In Search of Character and Calling by James Hillman, written about 20 years ago. The Soul's Code. We're going to be doing a class on this here for 4 weeks, starting March 14th. And I thought the best way to introduce the class would be to introduce the title of the book. The best place, I guess, to start is to distinguish between the genetic code, which we all know about, which is the manifestation of your physicality. You are all little genetic codes here, unfolded before us in this little congregation. Hillman is riffing on that title and asking the question as a psychologist, a renegade psychologist, that's what he calls himself, asking the question whether or not there might also be a code for the psyche or for the soul. So the title, The Soul's Code, that there might be certain coded information that arrives in each human psyche when we enter into this world, and that the purpose of being in this world is to have that code manifested. Just as the physical body goes through all those little strands and picks out all the different material and turns it into a physical manifestation, Hillman is suggesting that the psyche, each of us, comes into this world with our own code. That's the title of the book. Now the subtitle is In Search of Character and Calling. And what he means by that, as I understand it, is that in that code that is each of us, that is each of our souls, we come with a kind of image or character. Character here is not so much, the things that you teach people how to be. Here he's using the word character to describe you as a character. Each of you is a character. Each of us is a character. And he's suggesting that when we come into this world, each of us comes with a kind of acorn or a little seed of character, and that this world is sort of the soil of soul that nurtures and sort of brings that character into flowering, flourishing. And the idea of calling is that along with this character, this image that is you, each of us also comes into this world with a kind of call. There's something here for you to do. Someone here for you to be. Now, his book flies in the face of a lot of modern psychological theory because he's suggesting that there's something more to us than nurture and nature. Have you heard of nurture and nature? What's nurture? What's that refer to? Mom and Dad, society, the world nurtures us and brings us into being. He says, yeah, that's true. Nature. The genetic code. We come into this world with a certain sort of natural genetic makeup, and that brings us into manifestation. He's saying yes to nurture, yes to nature, and he's adding a third possibility that there may be some other factor working along with these, because he suggests that if we are just the products of nurture and nature, think about that for a moment, if we are just the products of nurture and nature, we are basically victims. Does that make sense? We're the victims of our parents, of society, of all the things around us. We're the victim of the genetic draw that we got. He's suggesting or asking us to ask this question, to entertain. He's not a metaphysician. Let me say that right now. He's not a metaphysician. So there's nothing in this book that is saying this is the way it is. As a depth psychologist, he is simply asking the question, what if, besides nurture and nature, there is some third element that is moving each of us toward that goal, into that code? And he begins the book by exploring the myth of And this is found in Plato's Republic. If you've never seen the book Plato Instead of Prozac, or Plato Not Prozac, you might check it out. It's a really good little book suggesting that some of these ancient philosophers probably were greater psychologists than many of our current psychologists. No offense, psychologists, but Plato's not a bad philosopher or psychologist. In the myth of which Hillman starts out with, he suggests that Well, in the myth itself, there was a fellow named who died and went into a near-death experience. This is our little character here, the blue character that says on it. He dies and he goes into the afterlife. And in the afterlife, he sees this kind of broad plain filled with dead people. And they're all there, their souls are there. And he sees a kind of above world and a lower world, and those two souls over there are the deceased. And he said some of these souls went up into the reward of the afterlife because these people had been good people. So they got to go experience about 1,000 years of their goodness. However, those that were not so good, they went into the underworld and they got to experience the consequences of their not so good life. And said that after a period of time, people came down from the upper world or up from the lower world, and what do you suppose happened? He said someone came out with a big container filled with round balls, and there were different fates written on them. And they were spilled out on this broad plain, and the people who had come from below and from above after their periods in the upper world or the lower world, they went around and they took however long it took to read the different fates on these balls. One might say, you will be a wealthy aristocrat, you will live in a palace, you'll have servants, blah, 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 blah. And if that person had learned in their experience in the afterlife, that's the fate they needed, they would claim it, and then they would reincarnate and go with their spirit guide into the next life to experience that fate in order to further their soul's progress. Another one might find a ball that said you will be a peasant, a very poor person, you'll be very sickly, yada, 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 and that person might pick that fate and decide to come into this world and experience that fate. Now again, Hillman is not a metaphysician. He's simply saying, what if there's something to this myth? That not only are we formed by nurture and nature, there is a kind of third thing that happens, that we come into this world with a character or a call or a fate, and that the purpose of this life is to live that character, that fate. So here they are. They have searched for their little fates, and zip, zip, into the lower world they go, and they are now at the Seattle Unity Church this morning. Now, Hillman calls this fate and daemon, after the ancient Greeks. He's asking this question, what if each of us is assigned or choose, or maybe both, to come into this world with a fate, and each of us is accompanied by a daemon? How many of you have heard of that use of the idea of daemon before? Tell me what that means. You guys participate here? Yeah? What's that mean, daemon? Shout it out. A spirit helper, spirit guide. The ancient Romans called it genius. The word we use today for genius, we've kind of redefined it, but the idea of genius for the ancient Romans was the same as the Greek idea of daemon, that each person has their own genius. You have your own spirit guide. Christians called it the guardian angel. Hindus call it the Atman, that sort of soul that comes with us, that spark or that piece of Brahman, the infinite, is an infinite or a tiny piece of that each of us comes with as our own fate. Many different names for it in many different cultures. So Hillman suggests the very beginning of the soul's code that each of us comes into this world as an ego or as a self, an identity, but we also have a twin or a daemon or a guide that comes with us and that guides us into the sort of nature that we have. In other words, he's asking, what if, or entertain the possibility that your current genetic physical makeup has actually been guided and that there's purpose in it? You ever have those moments where you look in the mirror and go, this sucks? At least it sucks purposefully. So he's suggesting that nature is guided by this daemon or this spirit, and that the nurture is as well, which would have to do with the parents we ended up with. So we're not victims of genetics. We're not victims of the nurturing or the culture we're in or the geography that we're in or whatever, natural or natural setting we're in. He says this removes victimhood and allows us to entertain the possibility that there might be a larger purpose to being here in this world. Let's take a look at how this shows up. And this is something he points out, that this idea is not just some ancient myth. There seems to be something in the human psyche that's fascinated by this notion of a guiding daemon. It shows up all over the place, especially in entertainment. In ancient Greece, you found it in the myth of Psyche. And the word psyche in Greek is our English word for soul. Hillman chides most of psychology. He's always in trouble. So if you're a psychologist, don't get mad at me, get mad at Hillman. He chides psychologists for typically translating psyche as mind. He says mind is what comes with the ego. Psyche is an entirely different matter, according to him altogether. But in the ancient Greek mythology, Psyche, a feminine character, or soul, was guided by Zephyr, the gentle west wind. So if you look at the myth of Eros and Psyche, you find that Zephyr is moving her into different situations. This is the idea of the daemon. You find it also, any of you familiar with The Golden Compass? Who's that, Pullman? Great movie, great book. In this, every character in the book has his or her own daemon. A guiding spirit, a totem, an animal that corresponds with their soul's calling, their fate. It's visible, and sometimes it changes, it morphs. But the idea is there in this book. The idea is in Pan's Labyrinth. How many of you have seen this movie? If you haven't, get it, watch it. It's an amazing, amazing movie of a little girl who comes into this world to find her way through this world back to the afterlife or the world beyond. And in this movie, there's a scene where a little insect flies up. Right here, you see the insect on the log and on the rock. And she follows this little insect. And then later the insect morphs into a fairy. And this fairy guides her through the underworld and through all kinds of experiences. That's the daemon. You find it in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. When Lucy goes to the closet into Narnia, she meets Mr. Tumnus, and Mr. Tumnus begins to teach her and guide her. And then she goes back into this earthly world, but she goes with the guidance, and she finds him being this helper, this guide that helps her find her fate. You find it in this very popular movie. Little Toto is the most obscure character in the story, but he's in almost every scene because he is Dorothy's daemon. Every significant thing that happens to Dorothy happens as a result of Toto's moves. Watch the movie. When the school teacher comes and takes Toto, he jumps out of the basket and he runs off, and Dorothy follows him to the medicine guy, whatever. Later on in the movie, when she's in the witch's palace and doing all this stuff, trying to, fulfill what the wizard is asking of her, Toto jumps out of the basket and they escape from the witch's palace. When they're in the wizard's presence, Toto goes up and he pulls the curtain back and shows Dorothy something she'd never seen before, that the wizard is a fake. In fact, if you watch the movie very carefully, you'll see that Toto has a little chain tied to his collar that's tied to the curtain, and he's just trying to get away from the chain. But it's a story. And then finally, in the very last scene, if you remember, Dorothy's in the basket. She's going to go home. Toto sees the woman with the cat, and what does Toto do? Jumps out of he's always jumping. Right? And this is what the daemon does. Hillman suggests that the daemon nudges us and sometimes shoves us to our fate. This is a very interesting idea. You find it all over the place. And the reason I asked for the reading today, which Todd did so very well, is that you find it in The Hobbit. And we could just go on all morning looking at these different examples. But Gandalf becomes the daemon to little Bilbo Baggins in his hole in the ground, which is a perfect symbol of the ego in its little hole in the ground with 6 meals a day. Did you know hobbits have 6 meals a day? Can you identify? Hole in the ground, eating 6 meals a day, nowhere to go, just sit in the hole and eat. And then Gandalf, the daemon, comes along, knocks on the door, and he invites Mr. Baggins out for a smoke, and Mr. Baggins is out there smoking his pipe, and Bilbo or Gandalf asks him a question. Would you like to go on an adventure? And do you remember what Bilbo said? No, nasty, uncomfortable things. Make you late for dinner. He goes, and the whole Hobbit story is a story of the daemon taking Bilbo in a direction that he would have never in a billion trillion years imagined himself going. Through tragedies and pathologies and neuroses that you can't even dream of, but also through successes and conquests and amazing experiences. This, Hillman suggests, in The Soul's Code, is the way the daemon works in our lives. Any of us that have been married know what it's like to take a Bilbo Baggins journey with the tragedies and the elations and all that goes with it. So Hillman in this book, part of what he does in each chapter is to help us see not only that our successes and triumphs are part of the daemon's fate, but also our pathologies, our addictions, our neuroses, that these things that we look at and go, oh, this is horrible, this is getting me off track. Really? He's suggesting maybe it's actually putting you on track. Hard to tell sometimes, isn't it? One of my favorite scenes where Bilbo's not only living in a hole in the ground, he's blowing smoke holes into the air because his world is so little until Gandalf pulls him out of it. That's what the daemon does. You see it with Luke Skywalker, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Yoda. They are images of the daemon. So Hillman in The Soul's Code suggests that each of us has this, and the reason they're depicted so often in great literature is because at the psychological level, this is something that exists. That movies have symbols of objective truths. These are not truths we invent, these are truths we discover. That movies and stories have these objective truths that are as objective as 2 + 2 = 4. But you cannot empirically prove them. They just seem to show up everywhere, suggesting that we each have some sort of code that we're here to fulfill. Now, here's how Hillman, this is what he says about the daemon. He says, each life, put your life, your name in there, is formed by its unique image or acorn. An image that is the essence of that life and calls it to a destiny. As the force of fate, this image acts as a personal daemon, an accompanying guide who remembers your calling. The ego forgets the calling almost daily. The daemon motivates, it protects, it invents, and persists with stubborn fidelity. It resists compromising reasonableness and often forces deviance and oddity upon its keeper. Amen. Especially when neglected or opposed. In other words, one of the ways, Hillman suggests, one of the ways the daemon gets us back to character and calling, our acorn, when we're so far off track, is through what we call pain. And if you're a parent, you know what this means when you have children. Sometimes no computer means you're off the track, sweetheart, we're going to get you back on it, called school. He goes on and says it offers comfort, the daemon, and can pull you into its shell of depression. His work on depression and what we call negative emotions is worth the price of the book, and I think checking the class out, because he reframes the idea of what we call mental illness, suggesting that many of the things that seem so painful to us are often the things that are pressing us down into the soil of soul because we have become unrooted. Now, the culture doesn't have time for this kind of pressing down, but the daemon doesn't really care, because our jobs and our big agendas are nothing compared to the fate and the character and calling that comes to us. Years ago, I read a book titled Lincoln's Melancholy. Any of you remember or see that? In that book, a psychiatrist looks at Lincoln, and before the word depression was invented, they talked about melancholy. Melancholy was a spirit that came to visit. And Lincoln was visited quite frequently by melancholy. There were times when he was president that he would take to the bed for 2 or 3 days under melancholy. Can you imagine that today? I mean, Lincoln's day, if somebody would come to meet with the president and he happened to be in a meeting with melancholy, depressed, they would say, come back in a couple of days, the president's in bed with the covers over his head. Can you imagine today if that were to happen? We have no room for it. And this is part of what Hillman points out, is that we have constructed a culture where largely the daemons' nudgings are basically pharmaceutically obliterated, or we have many ways of obliterating that daemon. And one of the reasons he suggests that some people are so miserable is because we have not learned to listen to that daemon. He goes on and says, it can make the body ill. It's out of step with time. In other words, it's not convenient for me to have this experience right now. Right? You understand what I'm saying? I've got work to do. Finding all sorts of faults, gaps, and knots in the flow of life, and it prefers them. It has affinities with myth or story, since it, that is the daemon, is itself a mythical being and thinks in mythical patterns. That's why it shows up in so many of these stories we read and hear about. It has much to do with feelings of uniqueness, of grandeur, and with the restlessness of the heart, its impatience, its dissatisfaction, its yearning. In other words, the daemon whispers to you, you're great. You're famous. You need to be on Oprah. Now, I know I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but many know this feeling like, I have something great to give to this world, and it's just not happening. And part of what Hillman's going to suggest is, it is happening. It's just not expressed in the way that you think it ought to be in this world, but it's expressed in your soul, so it's happening. It needs its share of beauty. It wants to be seen, witnessed, and accorded recognition. This is the daemon. Very quickly, some of the chapter titles. In a nutshell, chapter 1 in a nutshell, the acorn theory and redemption of psychology, where he's going to talk about this thing we started this morning. Growing down, not just up. The idea that before a plant can grow into the light, it must root into the dark soil. The parental fallacy. My parents is part of my call. Did you ever think of it that way before? Your parents are part of the call. Back to the invisibles, recovering the gods in all things. Neither nurture nor nature, something else. Penny Dreadfuls and pure fantasy, where he explores spiritual junk food. In other words, soap operas might actually be part of your soul's calling. Fate, nudges and shoves. Mediocrity, escaping the cult of celebrity. And what he's saying in here is that the daemon is moving us whether we get on Oprah or not. What we call mediocre, the daemon calls great because it's your fate. I don't have time to share some of the early experiences of my daemon, but in the class I will, if you care. But there will also be time for you to come and for us to explore this in more depth if you're interested. So I've been asked to pray, I remembered. And as the band comes to the stage and the singers come to sing, let's just take a moment and close with a little prayer. So if you'd like to close your eyes, Hillman, in his book, The Soul's Code, talks a lot about the invisibles. Those feelings, those thoughts, those experiences we have that don't show up in physical appearance. I invite you to take a breath, and this morning as we close, to just open your heart and mind and life to your personal daemon, genius, angel, guide. And say, yes, I am willing. Teach me, lead me, bring me to the fulfillment of my unique character and that call that my heart yearns for more than breath itself. And so it is.